yeah, this is a nice invitation to talk about this book. In a lot of ways, this book, well, it was initially Nicola's idea of having a collection for the network. So being able to kind of draw on some of the different regional contexts for EMI practices and pulling them together into a single volume. Initially, the plan, like this conference, was super ambitious with like over 50 chapters. And then through conversations with the publishers at Bloomsbury, we actually switched it around. It went through quite a lot of stages, but we ended up with 21 chapters from different regional contexts, and over 30 authors contributed, and many of them, well, several of them are in this room. So I thank you for your contributions. We also recently had a couple of book reviews come out in Language and Education and in TESOL Quarterly. Thank you, Serena. So do check out those book reviews, and obviously the book as well. There is a flyer in the conference information, which gives you 35% discount on that. Bloomsbury, thank you for that. Okay. So the other, and Benjing said, so yes, I am an editor for the journal System. I'm also an editor for the language teaching series for the Cambridge Elements. And there is a title that I wanted to draw your attention to, which is David Lasagabaster's English Medium Instruction in Higher Education. Through conversations, and thank you, Nadia, with Cambridge, they have agreed to make the entire language teaching series free to download during this conference. So to support the ELINET conference, which is absolutely amazing. So this QR code will take you to the page where you can click on any of those titles. Certainly drawing your attention to Lasagabaster's book there. These are 20,000 to 30,000 words in length, so they're kind of mini books, kind of articles. You'll also see these updated as we progress through the years. There are new titles coming out as well. I put this QR code here early in my presentation. In case you get bored, you can just flip through the titles and download the ones that you like. The ones that you like, please, when you download them, share the link as well on your networks. All right, so if you can share those on any Twitter, LinkedIn in particular, are good for kind of raising the awareness of those elements. Yeah, okay, that's the sales pitch done. Okay, so yeah, that's right, free. So this book, the focus that we decided on in terms of international perspectives of EMI, obviously this is, well, you all understand it as part of this network, recognizing that by kind of drawing on these different practices in different contexts, we can see or maybe gain some kind of understanding about what EMI is and the directions that it's going in. In terms of the kind of research directions and understanding that I gained through the process of editing this book and working as an editor in a number of other series, I will be sharing those ideas with you tomorrow, just before lunch as well. I guess I'm the just before lunch guy. I'm so yeah, finish on time. So one of the other things, so Heath mentioned it earlier, and this is the EMI Oxford group. So Carrie was also involved in this one along with Ernesto Macaro. Iki Aizawa, Sahanjo, and Mi Weiwei. So this is where this was the group who worked to pull together some ideas about what EMI means. So kind of pulling, on these different ideas about practices, implementation, policies to understand what, to try to provide a definition of EMI that's useful, in particular for comparing contexts. So this is really valuable and helps to kind of understand what we were doing with this book. Obviously, this paper came out years into working on the book, but it was really very helpful to establish some things in terms of, like Heath said, that it could be a controversial definition for some, that we understand EMI to be in non-Anglophone settings. So all of these contexts that are included in this volume are in non-Anglophone settings. That EMI should not uncritically adopt practices from Anglophone universities. So this also, we did see this as a kind of key theme that carried through the different chapters. And then this point about EMI research should identify comparable contexts for understandings of best practice is a really interesting one and important one that I kind of play around with quite a lot because I'm constantly comparing non-comparable contexts of EMI. But there are obviously, strengths and weaknesses to that practice of trying to compare such different contexts But what I'll do in this presentation is just show you how the way that we organized this volume helped us to kind of see things in different ways between contexts that we might not otherwise see overlap or comparability. So yeah, it was very kind of Ernesto Maccaro to provide the foreword for the volume. We had given him every chapter in the book to reflect on, and he came up with a series of questions to start with his foreword, which was really interesting, and I wanted to draw your attention to them. So he says, why is there currently such a burgeoning endeavor by researchers to describe the phenomenon of EMI? And it was almost in this way of like, ugh, why am I being asked to do this again? I totally get it. There's a lot. And it's interesting to think, it wasn't that long ago when we were saying, oh, EMI is such a hot topic, you should really look into this. Whereas now we're already saying we're overwhelmed, we're inundated. As an editor at System, I can say there's a lot of submissions. Earlier, Nicola mentioned, right, the number of requests that we get to supervise PhD projects on EMI studies. It's really exploding. And in fact, there's an interesting special issue coming out in System on EMI in emerging contexts that Heath and Doyen and Samantha Curl are guest editors for in that special issue. But yeah, why is there such a burgeoning endeavor? Are we just following a trend and jumping on a bandwagon? Now, that's a question that he asked a long time ago about what we were doing with EMI and EMI research. But it was interesting to see that he felt that this was still a significant question to ask today. Or are there such important issues arising from EMI in higher education that it would be a manifest failure on the part of the research community to ignore them? Now, this is obviously a new question that he's added to his jumping on the bandwagon question, which was really about, there are some discoveries out there that we maybe need to try to build on or try to understand a bit more. Well, at least he raises the question. That was how I answered it. Is there something particularly extraordinary and new about content subjects being taught through the medium of English in settings where one would normally expect them to be taught in the first language of the majority population? Now, this idea of content subjects being taught through the medium of English being extraordinary is really at the heart of what the EMI Oxford group was getting at in that paper in language teaching about what EMI is and what EMI does. So in our volume, bringing together ideas about EMI practices, EMI implementation at different levels of understanding that implementation, kind of helped us to see that there is something extraordinary happening, and particularly something that we can recognize through bigger or broader international perspectives on them. So really kind of building on some of the ideas from the earlier talk by Heath and Carrie on global EMI practices. This was what we were able to kind of build an understanding of as editors, Nicola and I, of this volume. The other point that Ernesto Maccaro made in the foreword was about EMI practices playing catch up. He said, there are indeed many issues arising from the EMI phenomenon that are of major educational importance, and the reason for the surge in academic interest is that the research community has, to a large extent, been playing catch up. And we recognize that. I think it's a really, it's a topic that we just can't avoid when we talk about EMI being a response to the developments that have been based more in neoliberal agendas and marketization of higher education, commodification of higher education, recognizing that English is that economic language that allows people to have better opportunities, for a nation's economy to grow, for the graduates to have more employability skills. I mean, there are all these assumptions about what English can do. We've heard metaphors like the silver bullet that English can be, which I always find a bit funny. Are we vampires? I don't know why we use that. But there's the idea that English is the answer. English gives us what we need. It's obviously a highly problematic concept, but one that certainly requires investigation, and investigation from basically as many different perspectives as we can get. I think that's where something like this network becomes so important, and our opportunities to share our ideas within this network are really going to benefit the kind of broader understanding. Not just, I mean, it's so much of the research we use is speaking to other researchers. I always think about that with Maccaro's models, the ostrich model, and I always think it's always a bit funny when we talking about global Englishes, and then here's this ostrich model, and half the room is going, "What's an ostrich? And how is that relevant?" So it's interesting when we think about let's try to get as many broad perspectives as we can to discuss it, right? Let's bring those ideas together as much as we can. Otherwise, we're really just catching up. The other important thing that kind of came out during the process of this, the assembly of this volume was a literature review part 1, I think is actually the title of it, published by British Council. With Carrie was involved in that, Samantha Curl, a few others. Nicola was the editor of that piece. And it was interesting because I think it pulls together some of the important ideas for people to draw on, but again, a kind of collection, right? Looking at the sort of broader ideas that you can gain by looking across, right, the literature. So factors which influence the implementation of EMI include the driving forces behind its introduction, language education policies, provisions for language support, and language proficiency requirements for students and staff. EMI programs can also vary in terms of how much English is used for teaching and learning in the curriculum. So this kind of point about what we recognize is a lot of variety, right? So that we're seeing a lot of these different, a lot of the same driving forces, but a lot of varieties of implementation. So the other thing that Nicola and I drew on in our editorial introduction to the volume were the many different models that are available out there in terms of our understanding of EMI, because these are the ways that we often think about trying to understand the practices that are happening. So we drew on, I'm not going to go through them, but we drew on, well, what we saw in a lot of the chapters was scholars drawing on some of these models to try to make sense of the practices that they were observing or that they were reading about or analyzing in some way. The interesting thing is Carrie, Nicola, and I, in our paper that was published in Language Teaching Research on EMI practices in Vietnam and Thailand, actually did struggle with this, and we did try to apply a model, I won't say which one, to what was happening in that place and realized it just didn't work. And so this is something that we should probably all think about in terms of how we theorize and how we make sense of practices in these other contexts that we're trying to apply models from other contexts, often from Anglophone contexts. So it's sort of it's an antithesis to what was talked about this morning in terms of kind of Anglophone constricted EMI versus global EMI. So global EMI is definitely our goal with the volume. Also in our introduction, and you'll recognize this beautiful continuum because Heath just used it on a slide this morning, and it was created by Heath. So a shout out to Heath. In our British Council report, and it was based on an adaptation from something that I did with Jean Thompson. So yeah, we're a small family here. And many iterations before that, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm missing Met from 1998 up here, but yeah, also Rose and Galloway ELT Journal and the Jacks, right? Richards and Dunn in 2021 and Ralph Journal and the typology of EMI, where they use actually exactly this graphic. So yeah, congrats to Heath on that one, without the shout out. Okay, so yeah, what you'll see in this is, so Heath's red circle flew off the screen. I'll see what mine does. But that a lot of the EMI practices that we talk about globally are something more like Quill. There is much more of a kind of language focus in the majority of contexts. But that a lot of the ways that we talk about it is more of this kind of EMI policy point. And we'll talk about things like needing language support, but that we see ourselves kind of drifting away from those ideas as well, which is problematic. The other thing that, so this explains the organization for the volume, which was rather than organizing it geographically, because we really felt like so these geographic contexts, that is the way that we talk about them, but in terms of practices isn't representative necessarily. So we talked about them more, we organized these chapters more by, by these 3 levels of focus. So macro level, meso level, micro level, which comes from Ali's study in Malaysia in 2009, is that right? So, and this was something that we also use. So Ike Aizawa and I also used this in our book chapter on EMI challenges in Japan. And so this was what we were able to see really interestingly. So Ali pointed out almost identical EMI challenges at these 3 levels that Ike and I did for the situation in Japan, which was at the macro level, so kind of broader national policy level. We see students being expected to improve English through content learning, right? Kind of byproduct, the kind of thing that Taguchi identified. At the meso level, sort of institutional level, or maybe kind of more locally regional level, policy guidelines do not provide specific plans to facilitate students' learning, such as English language support. And at the micro level, so classroom level, or students, teachers direct content and language teachers do not communicate with each other sufficiently to discuss their roles as to whether they are solely responsible for content and language teaching. So using that organization, what we did was gain an understanding of how different EMI practices address different EMI concerns. We had somehow miraculously 7 chapters at each level. And the chapter focus regions here you can see. So in Europe, we had the EMI strongholds of Denmark and the Netherlands, where EMI practices have been going on for a long time, but also Austria, Estonia, Italy, and Poland, which were really very different situations. Growth areas in South, Southeast, Central, and East Asia, Bangladesh, China, Hong Kong, Japan, Nepal, and South Caucasus, the South Caucasus and Vietnam, and underexplored areas in the Middle East and Africa, Ethiopia, Kuwait, South Africa, Tunisia, and Turkey, as well as Latin America, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. So I think there was a lot of interest in the kind of broad coverage that the volume contains, and it really did allow us to think about things sort of outside of these regional understandings of EMI practices. So at the macro level, we could see some of these key themes, such as post-colonial expansion and issues related to the opening of private universities and a separation of the population according to socioeconomic status in Bangladesh and Nepal. We saw the influences of existing policy, current demographics, and emerging trends in places like Brazil. And I think we have some people doing research on EMI in Brazil in this room. So you'll know exactly what this is about, because it's about the big changes that are happening now. Exponential growth of EMI programs and learner development needs and agency in China. So really taking a different direction there in terms of the large amount of investment in EMI in Chinese contexts. Accidental rise and not a good EMI model was given as the example in Denmark, right? So where we saw English being a useful language for academic studies, but without any of the kinds of intentions that we see at policy top-down initiatives for EMI implementation. Injustices of EMI in Ethiopia and Nepal, again, that separation by socioeconomic status, and things like partial EMI programs, right? So these different models of EMI practices in Turkey, which are very unique to that context. In terms of how that came together and our understanding at that level, we saw that EMI policies were believed to do far more than they could possibly do for several important reasons. Things like unrealistic expectations concerning ministry objectives and content and language learning objectives and employability skills. So these objectives were laid out as these are things that students who are studying through EMI programs are going to get, right? But we have lots of evidence to say they're not getting that. Low English proficiency of students and staff, poor quality of English language education at pre-tertiary level, insufficient English language support for students and staff. Basically, where we have EMI implementation in places where both students and teachers are unable to use English at the level that's expected on paper. Investments that ignore socioeconomic status, like EMI disadvantages those who don't already have proficiency in English. I thought that was a really big theme that we saw across all of the macro chapters. And investment is lacking in poorer regions or contexts. So just focusing on urban centers. At the meso level, we saw EMI as a matter of course in need of critique in places like Austria and Colombia. So this idea that of course we're studying in English without really critically approaching it. Ideological critique and politicization of EMI in Estonia was really interesting. So this was a debate between politicians on the move to English medium instruction in higher education and using that as a political platform. In Italy, EMI teacher training and the resistance, new resistance to planting people from Anglosphere into Italy to instruct people how to teach. In Poland, a kind of general lack of EMI research, probably because the money's not there. Integrating local language despite negative attitudes in South Africa. So being able to use Afrikaans, for example, in language, but despite the strict rules that it's English only. And university response ranges to government policy. So in Vietnam, seeing that the interpretations are really left wide open in terms of how institutions implement it. So the key themes here, EMI practices based on institutional initiatives fare better than those based on broader policy initiatives. So at this meso level, right, so institutions that are able to interpret the policies were better off. Policy adoption without adaptation is problematic. So anywhere where there are kind of strict policies that don't allow institutions that kind of flexibility were shown to be problematic in our meso chapters. Bottom-up practices may lack cohesion, right? So this kind of accidental rise or this idea that we don't have kind of broader curriculum goals or objectives can be a bit messy. EMI practices may be influenced by other agendas, like political initiatives that tend to be impractical, resulting in inconsistencies, teacher training that may promote native speakerism, local language integration that may raise further inequalities. So that kind of separation being highly problematic. At the micro level is where we actually, interestingly, started to see something a bit more positive. So students' positive voices about EMI in the South Caucasus, right? So there was a blog that was created for people to reflect, and they were kind of amazed at just how positive students were about EMI. In Hong Kong, where EMI students and teachers' creativity and trans-semiotic agency grew or developed as a result of EMI. In Japan, EMI challenges and content knowledge gains. So recognizing that we didn't have content knowledge loss necessarily, right? That there were ways to show the content gains did happen despite the challenges. In Kuwait, a little different realistic limitations to EMI content knowledge, recognizing that it's not always, right? It's just not the same, right? That you're not going to get the same content knowledge in every EMI context. Immersion for a sustainable university, so kind of shifting models away, kind of going back really. So rather than EMI model or modern EMI models, going back to the kind of French Québécois immersion models and a focus on sustainability at one university in Mexico. EMI, Englishization and commodification of higher education in the Netherlands. So really kind of problematizing the issues there, but in a space where people use English rather fluently. And employability and unrealistic expectations of EMI in Tunisia, which uses languages like Arabic and French, but they have to study in English. Problematic. Micro key themes, students and teachers' positive attitudes. We saw sort of exposure to English and ownership of English, helping things in creativity and agency, boosting people's positive attitudes about EMI. The content knowledge debate, I mean, basically we sort of had questions here that we don't necessarily answer in this volume, but is English just a byproduct or is there more to it? Is content knowledge necessarily limited by EMI? And then students versus policy objectives. So recognizing that needs-based sustainable models may provide a solution. Learning objectives may be met despite marketization of higher education. But ultimately around things like employability, we don't know, does Englishization necessarily lead to employability? Plenty of examples to suggest that they don't, but suggestions in our volume that they could. So diverse EMI practices, are they a welcome situation? EMI policies and practices vary globally. That is obvious. EMI practice is context dependent and very context dependent. So right down to a specific teacher or a specific student, it can be interpreted completely differently, even within that exact same space. Macaro is the one who said, Macaro and team said, the diversity in policy and practice is potentially a welcome situation, given the complexity of the different contexts in which EMI is being promoted. So, when we see all these different diverse practices, we can see opportunities for better understanding EMI and where the problems really lie. Commonalities in EMI policy implementation show us that these are things that we can address going forward. Evolving interpretations and current EMI policies. So recognizing the ways that we talked about EMI not even that long ago, the speeding train, from Julian Chappell in 2015 in Japan, we already talk about that quite differently now. And hopefully with a paper coming out soon with Nicola Carey and myself on surging EMI contexts. So to conclude, what we've done with this volume is show a response to the need for evolving understanding of current practices and conceptualizations of EMI policies. It provides an example of various methods used in EMI studies, which I'll expand on tomorrow in a workshop. And an attempt to embrace interdisciplinarity beyond applied linguistics. So pulling on a lot of the different disciplines, we saw that across the chapters, and evidence of how provision is still outpacing research. Lots of examples of that. And finally, a collection of complexities across contexts and common denominators in EMI in practice. Thank you very much. Sorry for the time.